The wagon didn't even slow down. Harlan Whitfield shoved the canvas flap aside with one hand and grabbed his daughter by the collar with the other. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, like she was a sack of spoiled grain he'd been meaning to toss for miles, and he threw her into the November dust of the Bozeman Trail. The blanket came next, sailing through the air and landing in a heap beside her. Then the canvas fell shut and the wagon kept rolling. Nora Whitfield hit the ground on her right hip and slid 2 feet through the cold dirt. She didn't scream. The impact knocked the breath out of her, and by the time she could draw air again, the wagon was already 20 yards ahead. She could see the back of it, the patched canvas, the iron pot swinging from hooks, the barrel of flour her father had traded 2 days of labor for in Fort Laramie. She could see her younger sister's shoes poking out beneath the canvas hem, small and still not moving toward the opening to look back at her. Nobody looked back. The wheels creaked. The mules plodded. The Whitfield family moved northeast toward Bozeman, and Nora sat in the middle of the trail with dust settling on her skirt and her right hip throbbing and the temperature dropping toward 15 degrees. It was November 14th, 1873, in what would become Montana Territory. The nearest settlement was Bozeman, 43 miles northeast. She had no food, no tools, no weapon. She was 16 years old, and she was completely alone in a landscape that killed grown men in 3 days. She watched the wagons shrink against the Absaroka Range, watched it become a dark speck, watched the speck dissolve into the gray distance until there was nothing left but empty trail and empty sky and the sound of wind moving through dead grass. And she felt nothing, not fear, not anger, not even the cold, though the cold was real and getting worse. She felt a kind of hollowness, as if someone had reached inside her chest and scooped out everything that made her a person, leaving only a shell sitting in the dirt. She sat there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. She didn't know. Time had become irrelevant in a way she'd never experienced before, because time only matters to people who have a future. And in that moment, Nora Whitfield was not sure she had one. What brought her back was the cold. Not an idea about the cold, not a rational thought about hypothermia or survival. The cold itself. Her fingers began to lose feeling, and the numbness crept up her hands toward her wrists. And her body did what her mind couldn't. It demanded movement. Move or die, not a decision, a reflex. She stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, picked up the blanket. Not because she was brave, because there was no other option. The reason her father had thrown her out was simple, and it had been building for months. Nora had been teaching her younger sisters to read. She'd been using Harlan's Bible, the heavy leather-bound King James he kept in the front of the wagon, and opened only on Sundays, and she'd been doing it in secret during the evening hours when Harlan went to check the livestock and her stepmother thought she was washing dishes at the creek. Harlan Whitfield believed that educated women brought nothing but trouble to a homestead. He'd said it in Pennsylvania before they left. He'd said it crossing the plains. He said it with the conviction of a man who had never examined a belief in his life and never intended to. Reading led to thinking, thinking led to opinions, and opinions in a woman led to disobedience. He'd made the rule clear: no reading for the girls, not even scripture. Nora had done it anyway, had done it knowing the consequences, had done it because her sisters were 8 and 6 and their eyes lit up when the letters became words and the words became sentences, and she could not watch that light go unlit. Not when she knew how to kindle it. But it wasn't Harlan who delivered the final blow. The night before, Nora had lain awake in the back of the wagon and heard voices through the canvas. Her stepmother Lucille speaking to Harlan in that particular tone she used when she wanted something and intended to get it, not shouting. Lucille never shouted. She spoke quietly, and that was worse. That girl is more like her mother every day. The Indian woman you don't talk about. She's willful, Harlan. She undermines everything I try to build with this family. If you don't deal with her, I will take my children and leave when we reach Bozeman. You decide. Silence from Harlan, a long, terrible silence. And Nora, lying in the dark with her sister's warm bodies pressed against her sides, understood that the silence was the verdict. Harlan wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to defend her. He had already chosen. She'd known and she hadn't run. Maybe because she had nowhere to run to. Maybe because some part of her still believed her father might choose differently. He didn't. Now she stood on the Bozeman Trail with the wind picking up and the light failing, and nothing in the world belonging to her except a worn blanket and the clothes on her back. But Nora Whitfield carried something else, something her father had never noticed during those long months on the wagon. She had been watching, not daydreaming, not wandering in her thoughts the way Harlan assumed girls did, watching, studying, the way the wheelwright repaired cracked axles by the firelight, the way the blacksmith forge welded broken hardware with precise, economical strokes, the way one Swedish family built their first shelter using nothing but prairie sod and iron determination. She'd watched a man repair harness leather with sinew and pine pitch. She'd watched women render fat into soap and tallow candles. She'd absorbed every practical skill that passed before her eyes, because some instinct told her that knowing how things worked was the most valuable currency a person could carry. And she had listened to Ernst Kepler 3 weeks before her father threw her out on a cold evening beside the wagon train's communal fire. Nora had watched an old German stonemason try to change the world. Nobody else was watching. That was the point. Ernst Kepler was past 60 thin as a fence rail with calloused hands and bright eyes and an accent so thick some people pretended not to understand him just to avoid conversation. He'd been drawing in the dirt with a pointed stick, sketching for a group of men who stood with their arms crossed and their faces skeptical. He was talking about something he called a Russian stove, a masonry heater, a way to warm a house using a fraction of the wood that a conventional fireplace consumed. The men had drifted away one by one. Some laughed. One said, "Stick to laying bricks, old man." By the time the last of them wandered off to check his livestock, Ernst was sitting alone beside his dirt drawings, looking at them the way a man looks at a letter nobody will read. Nora had been washing pots 10 steps away. She set down the last one, dried her hands on her skirt, and walked over. "What are you drawing?" Ernst looked up, surprised. Then something shifted in his face, something between gratitude and caution, and he began to explain. He talked for 2 hours. Nora didn't move. The principle, he said, was thermal mass. You build a firebox out of stone, heavy and dense. But instead of sending the smoke straight up through a chimney and losing all that heat to the sky, you build channels inside the masonry. Long, winding passages that force the smoke to travel through the stone before it exits. The smoke gives up its heat to the mass as it travels. Every foot of channel means more warmth transferred into the rock. Then after the fire dies, the stone radiates that captured heat back into the room, slowly, steadily, for 18 hours or more. A conventional fireplace, Ernst said, lost 80% of its heat straight up the chimney. A proper masonry heater kept 70% in the room. In Milwaukee, where he'd lived for 20 years, he'd heated his entire house on 2 fires a day, morning and evening. The stone did the rest. "Everyone calls me crazy," he said, tracing the serpentine channels in the dirt with a stick. "But in Germany and Russia and Scandinavia, people have heated with masonry for 300 years. It works. It has always worked. Americans are just too proud to learn from anyone else." Then he went quiet. His hands stopped moving. He looked at his drawings, but he wasn't seeing them anymore. He was seeing something far away. "I built this stove for my wife," he said so softly Nora had to lean forward. "In Milwaukee, Anna never felt cold one single day in 20 years. She died last spring. I came west because the house could not bear only one person in it anymore." Nora didn't know what to say. She was 16 and had never lost someone she'd chosen to love, only someone she'd been born loving, which was different in ways she couldn't articulate. So she just nodded, but she memorized everything. Not just the technical details, the channel dimensions, and the firebox ratios, and the chimney height calculations. She memorized the reason Ernst wanted to teach, because this knowledge had kept someone he loved warm and alive. That made it sacred in a way that had nothing to do with church. Now standing on the Bozeman Trail with the last light dying behind the mountains, Nora called up every detail of Ernst's lesson. She could see his dirt drawings in her mind as clearly as if they were etched in stone. Channels rising from the firebox, turning horizontal, running along walls, turning again. Smoke traveling 15 feet through masonry before exiting. Heat captured in rock. Rock radiating warmth through the long Montana night. But knowledge without shelter was just a different way to freeze. She needed to survive tonight first. Her mother had been a Shawnee woman from Ohio. Nobody talked about that in front of Harlan, and after she died when Nora was 8, nobody talked about it at all. But Nora remembered, not the language, not the stories, the practicality, the absolute unsentimental efficiency of a woman who never wasted emotion, never panicked, and never assumed the world owed her comfort. She remembered one afternoon in particular, winter in Ohio. Nora was 7. Her mother took her into the woods and taught her to read the snow, where animals had passed, where water flowed beneath the surface, which trees had died standing and were ready to become fuel. Don't look at the forest, her mother said. Look at each thing in the forest. The forest is too big, each thing you can solve, Nora looked at the landscape now, not the vastness of it, each thing. Water there was a creek cutting through cottonwoods at maybe 200 yards north. She could hear it faintly beneath the wind. Timber lodgepole pine climbed the slopes to the west, dense and straight. Shelter the creek would have cut banks, overhangs, natural windbreaks. She started walking toward the tree line. If she was going to die out here, it wouldn't be from standing still. She reached the creek as the sun touched the mountain peaks. The water ran clear and cold, probably spring fed from higher up. She knelt and drank until her stomach ached, then walked downstream, scanning the bank. 30 yards down, she found a cut bank that formed a natural windbreak, maybe 6 feet high, with enough overhang to keep off snow. Not shelter, a place to survive one night. She gathered deadfall until she had an armload, then stood holding it and realized she had no way to start a fire. The November wind pushed through her clothes, and she felt the temperature dropping fast, the kind of drop that came when the sky cleared and the stars came out, and there was nothing between you and space but thin mountain air. She wedged herself into the cut bank, piled branches against the opening to block wind, pulled the blanket over her head and shoulders, and drew her knees to her chest. The night nearly killed her. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees by her estimate based on how fast the puddles in the creek froze. Cold enough that her fingers went numb, even tucked under her arms. Cold enough that she shook so hard, her jaw muscles cramped, and her teeth rattled against each other in a rhythm she couldn't stop. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every time her body began to relax toward unconsciousness, the cold shocked it back awake, and she'd jerk upright, gasping, heart hammering, muscles clenching. Sometime past midnight, in the deepest cold, Nora cried. Not loudly. The tears ran down her face in the darkness, and she didn't wipe them because pulling her hands from under the blanket would cost heat she couldn't spare. She cried because she was thinking about her sisters. Not about Harlan, not about Lucille, about 2 small girls who would grow up without anyone to teach them their letters. Who would live in a house where curiosity was punished and knowledge was forbidden, and no one would ever again sit with them in the evening and watch the wonder in their eyes when marks on a page became words that meant something? She cried until the tears stopped coming. Then she started counting, counted to 1,000, started over, counted the number of meals she'd helped her mother prepare, counted the wagon wheels she'd watched the wheelwright repair, counted the number of times her father had told her she'd never amount to anything. She stopped counting that one. When dawn came gray and bitter, Nora crawled out of the cut bank on hands and knees. Her muscles had stiffened in the cold, and every movement sent pain through her joints. She stood slowly bracing against the dirt wall and looked at the world she'd been given. Something had changed in the night. The fear was still there underneath, but it had compressed into something harder and quieter. Not courage exactly, a refusal. She refused to die here. Not dramatically, not with clenched fists and declarations. She simply looked at the idea of dying in this cut bank and said no to it the way you'd say no to a door you didn't intend to walk through. Quietly, absolutely. She understood one thing with perfect clarity: shelter without heat was just dying slower. She spent that first full day learning the landscape. She walked a half-mile radius from her cut bank camp, and she looked at each thing the way her mother had taught her. Found where the creek pooled deep enough to maybe hold fish. Marked the pines that had died standing their wood dry and ready to burn. Located a game trail with fresh elk droppings. Discovered an outcrop of sandstone that broke into flat pieces when she pried with a stick. By sunset, she still had no food and no fire, but she had a mental map of every resource within walking distance. The second night dropped to 6 degrees, colder than the first. She added more branches to her windbreak and thought about Ernst Kepler's serpentine channels, about stones holding heat like a promise. Third morning, she got lucky. Found a dead rabbit in the underbrush killed by a hawk that got scared off before eating. She washed it in the creek and ate it raw, forcing herself to chew slow and thorough the way her mother had taught her with jerky. The raw meat was tough and cold and tasted like iron, but it was protein. And protein was the difference between thinking clearly and thinking in circles. Fourth and fifth days, she searched for flint. Checked every rock outcrop within a mile. Sandstone, granite, a vein of quartz. No flint. She tried friction methods, the bow drill she'd seen demonstrated back in Pennsylvania. Couldn't get it to work with frozen fingers and unfamiliar wood. She tried striking rocks together until the skin on her palms split open and left blood on the stones. Nothing sparked. On the fifth day, she found salvation in a broken bottle. Someone had tossed it from a wagon months or years ago, and it lay half buried in the grass near a campfire ring that had gone cold long before winter. The curved glass caught the weak November sun and threw a bright point of light onto the ground. And Nora dropped to her knees and stared at it and felt something crack open in her chest that might have been hope. She spent 3 hours nursing a coal from a tinder bundle of shredded cottonwood bark and dry grass. She held the glass at exactly the right angle and blew so gently her head went light and spots swam in her vision. Twice the ember died and she started over, hands shaking, jaw set. The third time the bark caught, a thin curl of smoke, then a tongue of flame small as a fingertip that grew as she fed it, wisps of grass and shavings of dry wood. When the fire finally crackled and popped and threw heat against her face, Nora sat back on her heels and said aloud to no one, or maybe to her mother, "Problem 1, done." Her voice shook, but not from the cold. With fire, she could think beyond tonight. And the thinking led her to one conclusion: the wagon trains were done for the season. Nobody would come through until April. Bozeman was 43 miles away, through terrain she couldn't navigate without gear. That left one option: winter here in this valley or die trying to leave it. She needed 4 things in order: fire, shelter, food supply, and heat. Not warmth, heat. The kind that would keep her alive when the real cold came, when temperatures dropped to 20 and 30 below zero, and stayed there for weeks. She had fire now. The rest would take everything she had. She spent a week scouting for the right spot, and she found it a quarter-mile upstream where the valley narrowed. A natural alcove cut into the hillside, maybe 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with solid earth on 3 sides and a southern exposure that would catch winter sun. She stood inside it and felt the difference immediately. The earth walls blocked the wind. The southern opening let in light. 3 sides of insulation already built by nature. She could construct a front wall across the opening, install a door, and have an earth-sheltered cabin that would stay warmer than any freestanding structure. And more than that, the hillside's mass would work with Ernst's chimney design. The earth and the stone would hold heat together, reinforcing each other. This was November 26, 1873. She figured she had maybe 3 weeks before the serious snow started. 3 weeks to see if a 16-year-old girl could build something most grown men wouldn't attempt. She started clearing the alcove the next morning, hauling out rocks by hand, leveling the floor with a flat stone used as a scraper, digging a foundation trench across the 15-foot opening with a sharp-edged sandstone slab that served as a crude shovel. Her hands blistered. The blisters broke and bled. The blood dried and the skin began to harden into calluses that would thicken over the coming weeks until her palms felt like leather. She worked 12 hours a day, stopped only when darkness made it impossible to see. On the 8th day, she heard hoofbeats. Nora grabbed the largest stone within reach and turned toward the sound hammering. A rider appeared through the trees on a raw-boned horse, a man in a bearskin coat with a tangled beard and quick, appraising eyes. The kind of eyes that looked at everything and calculated its value in the same glance. Silas Croy, trapper and fur trader, roughly 35, with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent years in country where the rules were whatever he said they were. He sat his horse and watched Nora work for a full minute before speaking. "What are you doing out here by yourself?" "Building shelter for winter." Croy dismounted, walked the perimeter of the alcove looking at the cleared space, the foundation trench, the pile of stones she'd been gathering. His eyes lingered on the southern exposure, the proximity to water, the natural wind protection. "This is a good spot," he said, and his voice had changed. Softer, more interested. Natural walls on 3 sides, close to the creek out of the prevailing wind. "I've been looking for a place to set up a winter fur station." Nora stopped digging, stood straight, met his eyes. "I was here first. I'm building. This is mine." Croy smiled, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with friendliness. "Frontier law, little girl. A place belongs to whoever can hold it." He swung back up onto his horse and looked down at her from the saddle. "We'll see how long you hold it." He rode north and disappeared into the timber. Nora stood watching the trees where he'd gone, gripping the stone in her hands so hard her knuckles whitened. Her heart was still beating fast, but something had shifted. The fear she'd felt was already hardening into something else, something with edges. She went back to digging. By December 3rd, the foundation trench was filled with fitted stones, and she was ready to start the walls. Her body had changed in 3 weeks. She'd lost weight she didn't have to lose, and her hip bones jutted against her skirt. But her arms had new muscle from lifting stone, and her hands could grip a 40-pound rock without trembling. That afternoon, a mule appeared on the creek trail. The rider was an old man, late 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many winters take too many lives. Aldrich Wendt, German farmer, homestead 7 miles north along the creek. 3 years in this valley. He sat on his mule and watched Nora wrestle a stone into position for a long time before he spoke. "You're that girl, the one got thrown from the Whitfield wagon." Nora straightened, wiped her hands on her skirt. "Yes, sir." Aldrich dismounted, walked to the foundation and knelt to examine the stonework. He ran his fingers along the joints the way a man touches something he respects. "Good fitting," he said. "Tight joints. Where'd you learn?" "Watched a stonemason in our wagon train. German fellow named Ernst Kepler." Aldrich's eyebrows rose. "Ernst crazy, Ernst who wouldn't stop talking about his Russian stove." Nora allowed herself a small smile, the first in 3 weeks. "That's the one, except I don't think he was crazy." Aldrich stood, brushed off his knees, looked at her for a long time, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Then he spoke, and his voice was different, heavier. "3 years I've been in this valley. First winter, 2 families froze to death. January wood ran out cold, hit 40 below. I found them, 4 people, 2 grown, 2 children, sitting around a cold fireplace. Looked like they were sleeping." He paused. "Next winter, a man's cabin caught fire from an overheated stovepipe. I smelled the smoke from my place, but got there too late." He looked at her foundation, at the alcove, at the 16-year-old girl with bleeding hands and sharp eyes. "You're telling me you're going to build something better than what killed them? No tools, no help, 2 weeks." Nora pointed to the alcove, explained the plan. 3 walls already done by nature, front wall 4 feet thick, and the chimney Ernst's designed the kind that holds heat and stone instead of losing it to the sky. Aldrich shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to wonder at the audacity of it. "I got an old axe head back at my place," he said. "No handle, but you could make one. Got a broken saw, too, maybe 12 inches of blade left. And I suppose I can spare a few pounds of salt pork if you're going to starve otherwise." Nora felt something shift in her chest. She kept her voice steady. "I'd be obliged, sir. I'll pay you back come spring." Aldrich waved that off. "Just don't die, girl. I got enough ghosts on this creek. Don't need yours." He rode back north. Nora stood watching him go, and she understood what he'd really given her. Not the tools, though the tools would change everything. The possibility that someone somewhere believed she could do this. She had never received that from her father. The feeling was unfamiliar, like wearing a coat that actually fit for the first time in her life. That night, lying beside her fire with the stars hard and bright above the alcove, Nora did not count. For the first time since being thrown from the wagon, she didn't need to fill the silence with numbers. She thought about the old German farmer who rode 7 miles to check on a girl he didn't know, who looked at her stonework and saw competence instead of foolishness, who offered his tools because he'd buried enough people in this valley and didn't want to bury one more. She fell asleep, actually slept. And when she woke at dawn, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope exactly, readiness. The axe changed everything. With a handle carved from green ash and wedged tight with a stone shim, Nora could fell trees instead of gathering deadfall. She cut lodgepole pines, not the massive ones, but the straight 6-inch trunks that were light enough to drag alone, limbed them with the broken saw, hauled them to the alcove, and started building the front wall's frame. The design came together in her head as she worked the way her mother's instructions used to come together, one piece at a time, each piece making the next one obvious. A double wall, 2 log frames with stones and earth packed between them. Inner frame to support the roof beams, outer frame to protect the stonework from weather. The mass between them to insulate and stabilize. Crude engineering, but sound. By December 8th, the frame was up, and she'd started packing the cavity with fitted stones and clay mortar, mixed from creekbed clay and coarse sands. The chimney was the part that would save her life or kill her. She knew it had to be massive, 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, taking up a quarter of the cabin's interior. The firebox at floor level in the back corner, built from the flattest stone she could find, mortared tight with her best clay mix. Opening 2 feet wide, 18 inches tall, big enough for substantial wood, small enough to concentrate heat. Then the channels. The first flue rising from the back of the firebox, turning horizontal to run along the rear wall. At the corner, turning again, running along the side wall back toward the front. 15 feet of travel through stone before the smoke finally exited through a vertical stack at the front corner. Every inch of that travel was heat transferred into masonry. She built it stone by stone, fitted each one by hand, mortared each joint by feel, pressing clay into gaps with her fingers until the surface was smooth and the seal was tight. She made mistakes, tore out a section of channel that had collapsed and rebuilt it with better bracing, cracked a cornerstone, and spent half a day finding a replacement. Learned that mortar mix too wet crumbled when it dried, and mortar mix too dry wouldn't bond. By December 11th, the chimney was nearly complete. The serpentine channels were done. The masonry was curing in the cold air. She was fitting stones for the vertical exit stack when she heard hoofbeats again. Not Croy. This rider sat straight in the saddle, military posture, and his eyes swept the construction site with the practiced assessment of a man who'd built things for the United States Army. Preston Hale had arrived, and he had opinions. Preston Hale was the kind of man who entered a room and immediately found everything wrong with it. He'd spent 12 years in the Union Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges and fortifications under fire, and the habit of cataloging structural failures had never left him. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked carved from the same granite Nora had been pulling from the creek bed. He'd taken a land claim 5 miles west and was building what he considered a proper cabin with a proper fireplace, the kind that had heated American homes since the colonies. He dismounted, tied his horse to a pine, and walked the perimeter of Nora's construction without greeting her. He touched the stonework, pressed on the wall frame, looked up at the chimney mass rising from the back corner. Then he turned to her with the expression of a man delivering a diagnosis. That chimney's going to collapse under its own weight. You've got no support structure above the second channel turn, and clay mortar won't hold through repeated heating and cooling cycles. He pointed to the firebox. Those sandstones will crack from thermal shock. First hot fire, they'll split, and your whole channel system loses integrity. He moved to the sidewall. Your draft calculations, assuming you made any, can't account for the friction loss in those bends. Fire's going to smoke you out or choke itself dead. He looked at the hillside above the cabin. And come spring thaw, you'll have a river running through your living room. He delivered all of this the way he might have briefed a commanding officer. Facts, problems, no suggestion that solutions existed. Nora kept fitting stones while he talked. She'd learned something about men like Hale in the wagon train. They needed to finish talking before they could start listening. When he stopped, she answered without looking up. Chimneys built on bedrock. I dug 3 feet down to reach it. The sandstone will crack, but it'll hold through one winter, and I'll rebuild the firebox with better stone next summer. The draft works because I've got enough vertical rise and the right ratio between the firebox opening and the exit, and I dug a drainage channel along the back wall that will carry snowmelt around the cabin. Hale walked the construction again. Slower this time. He checked the foundation. Solid. He examined the channel joints. Crude but surprisingly tight. He pushed against the wall frame and it didn't move. He didn't want to admit what he was seeing, but he was an engineer and engineers don't get to ignore evidence. Even if all that holds, he said, you're talking about heating this space with 1 burn a day. You know how long it takes a mass that size to absorb enough heat to radiate? You'll freeze waiting. Nora set down the stone she was holding, looked at him directly. Mr. Hale, I've been freezing for a month. I know exactly what cold feels like. And I know that this chimney, once it's charged, will hold this cabin between 50 and 60 degrees through the night on a single morning fire. That's the difference between sleeping and dying. Hale stared at her. He wanted to argue. Something in her voice stopped him. This wasn't a girl guessing. This was someone who'd run the numbers in her head through shaking, sleepless nights, who'd calculated heat retention while her teeth chattered, who understood the physics not because she'd studied them in a book, but because her life depended on getting them right. He'd seen grown men attempt construction projects with less planning and more arrogance. You've got about a week before real weather hits, he said finally. After that, you won't be able to work outside. Better have that roof on and the chimney finished. He mounted his horse, then paused, one hand on the saddle horn, and said something Nora didn't expect. I lost a daughter at Chickamauga, not in the battle, camp fever. She was about your age. He didn't elaborate, didn't say he was sorry or that Nora reminded him of anyone. Just offered the fact like a stone laid on a foundation load bearing and permanent, then rode away. And Nora understood why he'd been so harsh. Hale wasn't trying to discourage her. He was trying to prepare her, because he'd already failed to protect one girl, and the thought of watching another one die because he hadn't spoken up was something his engineer's conscience couldn't bear. That night, lying beside the fire with the chimney mast looming in the darkness like a half-finished monument, Nora allowed herself 10 seconds of doubt. She heard Hale's voice listing failures. She heard her father's voice behind it, the old refrain she'd stopped counting. She let both voices speak. Then she got up, walked to the chimney in the dark, and pressed her palms against the stone. Every joint tight, every stone fitted by her own hands. She went back to the fire and slept. The roof went up on December 14th. Not elegant. Straight lodgepole logs laid across the wall frames, bark side up. Then a layer of stripped bark arranged like shingles overlapping to shed water. Then 8 inches of earth packed on top, tamped down with a flat stone until it was dense and solid. The weight was enormous, pressing down on the walls with the steady force of the hillside itself, but the 3 earth walls and the thick front wall distributed the load the way a bridge distributes traffic. Spread it wide enough and any weight becomes manageable. She left a gap at the front corner for the chimney stack to exit building the stonework up and around it, sealing the junction with her best clay mortar mixed with pine pitch for water resistance. The chimney itself was complete. The vertical exit stack rose 3 feet above the roofline fitted stones, mortared and capped with a flat slab to keep rain out. December 15th, 12 degrees. Snow falling steady and soft, the kind that accumulates fast because there's no wind to scatter it. Nora had enough dry wood stacked inside for 3 days. She had a firebox she'd built stone by stone over 2 weeks. She had channels she designed from memory and constructed by feel. She struck fire from her glass lens, nursed the flame with shredded bark, and fed it into the firebox. Smoke poured into the cabin, not catastrophic, not a wall of black, but enough to sting her eyes and tighten her throat and send her backing toward the door opening with her sleeve pressed over her mouth. The smoke curled and pulled against the ceiling instead of drawing upward through the channels. The draft was wrong. Too much resistance in the bends, not enough pull from the stack. And in that moment, with smoke filling the space she'd built with her bleeding hands, Nora heard Hale's voice clearly. "Fire's going to smoke you out." And behind it, older and colder, "She'll never amount to anything." She stood in the smoke for 10 seconds. Let those voices speak. Felt the familiar weight of doubt press down on her chest like the earth on the roof. Then she let the fire die, climbed out through the door opening, and scrambled up the hillside to the roof. Snow soaked through her skirt and stung her bare hands as she pulled herself over the edge. The chimney stack rose from the front corner, solid and cold and wrong. Not wrong in design, wrong in height. She needed more draw, which meant more stack, which meant more stones in the snow. She built in the snow for 2 hours. Carried stones from the pile below, climbed the hillside with each one fitted them by feel because her fingers were too cold for precision, mortared them with clay she'd mixed that morning and kept from freezing by the fire. 18 inches of additional height. Her hands bled. The blood froze on the stones and became part of the mortar. She climbed back down, rebuilt the fire. This time the smoke pulled clean. She could hear it, a low, steady rush like wind through a hollow log as the draft caught and the smoke traveled up from the firebox into the first horizontal channel along the back wall, around the corner, along the side wall, and up through the stack into the gray December sky. The sound of physics working. The sound of Ernst Kepler being right. She fed the fire steadily for 3 hours. Dry lodgepole split thin, laid in careful rows to maximize burn temperature. The firebox stones began to radiate heat she could feel from 6 feet away, a wave of warmth that hit her face like opening a bread oven. Then the channel stones warmed section by section, each segment acknowledging the heat as the smoke passed through. First warm to the touch, then hot, then radiating with a steady, deep warmth that was nothing like the quick, sharp heat of an open fire. This was stored heat, patient heat, heat that would be there in 6 hours when the fire was dead. By noon, the entire chimney structure was warm. By late afternoon, Nora pressed her back against the channel wall and felt warmth soak through her clothes, through her skin, into muscles that had been clenched against cold for a month. She closed her eyes. The cabin temperature had climbed to 48 degrees, while outside the snow fell and the thermometer dropped toward zero. She banked the coals that evening, sealed the firebox opening with a flat stone to trap the remaining heat, stuffed every wall gap with dried moss and grass, hung the blanket across the door opening, built her sleeping platform from lashed poles and pine boughs. She woke at midnight and reached out from under the blanket to touch the chimney stones. Still warm, 90 degrees maybe. The cabin held steady in a cocoon of radiating warmth while the mountain darkness pressed against the walls outside. She woke again near dawn. Cooler now, but her breath didn't fog. The stones had given up most of their heat slowly, steadily through the night like a heart-beating warmth into the room. The cabin had held around 38 degrees. Outside, the world had dropped to 6 below zero. She'd survived the night warmer than she'd been in a month. Using a fraction of the wood an open fireplace would have consumed in an hour. Word moved through the valley the way sound moves through cold air, sharp and fast and impossible to ignore. A girl, 16, built a cabin into a hillside with some kind of experimental chimney, still alive. Marin Tully rode over on December 19th. She was 34, a widow since August, when her husband's horse threw him and his head found a rock. She had 2 children, a cabin that leaked heat like a sieve, and a face that showed every sleepless night of the past 4 months. She'd been thinking about giving up the claim, taking the children east. But the cost of train tickets was more than she had, and winter had closed the passes before she could save enough. I stayed because I couldn't leave, she told Nora, sitting inside the cabin, with her hands pressed flat against the warm chimney stones. Same as you, I suppose. She looked around the small space, felt the warmth radiating from the mass, felt the difference between this and her own drafty cabin, where the fire roared and the heat vanished and the children slept in coats. Show me how it works, she said. Nora didn't explain in words. She learned something from Ernst about the way knowledge transfer showing was always better than telling. She took Marin's hand and placed it on the stones nearest the firebox, where the surface was almost too hot to touch, then moved it along the channel wall toward the corner where the heat softened, then along the side wall where it softened further, then near the exit stack where the stones were barely warm. Feel that, Nora said. That's the heat being pulled out of the smoke. By the time it reaches the stack, there's almost nothing left. The stone keeps it. Marin pressed both hands against the warm wall and closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were bright. We were just too stubborn to listen, she said softly. She left that afternoon, but she'd be back. Edith Pardo arrived an hour later, and she was not interested in touching stones. Edith was roughly 45, the wife of the valley's only preacher, a woman whose spine seemed to be made of iron and whose mouth was built for disapproval. She examined the cabin the way a health inspector examines a restaurant, looking not for what worked, but for what violated code. A girl, Edith said, living alone in the wilderness. No family, no church, no man to vouch for her. She turned to Nora with eyes like January. You think about how that looks. Nora met her gaze. Ma'am, I don't have time to worry about how things look. I'm worried about making it to January. Edith's lips thinned. Pride, that's exactly what got you thrown out by your father. The words landed like a slap, not because they were true, but because Edith had reached for the one weapon guaranteed to draw blood. The shame of being discarded. The implication that Nora had deserved it. Nora said nothing. Edith left. Marin Tully, who'd been mounting her horse outside, had heard everything. She rode back to the cabin door and looked down at Nora. Don't let her eat at you. Edith thinks any woman who manages alone is a personal insult to the order she believes in. Then quieter, but she talks, and people listen to her. Some families who might have come to learn from you won't come now because Edith will tell them it's against God's will for them to take instruction from an unmarried girl living in sin with a pile of rocks. Nora watched Marin ride away into the snow and understood that survival in this valley meant more than defeating the cold. There were human winters too, made of judgment and gossip and the quiet cruelty of people who feared what they didn't control. Barnett Griggs arrived on December 27th and changed the chimney's future. He was 47, a railroad surveyor turned homesteader, and he came with the practical eye of a man who'd built bridges across rivers and grades across mountains. He examined the construction thoroughly, tracing the channels with his fingers, measuring the stack, height by eye, checking the mortar joints. Then he sat on a log, took off his hat, and delivered his verdict. Clever. Genuinely clever. But you're missing something that's going to matter in about a week. He pointed at the chimney stack. When we get a real blizzard, and we will, the wind comes screaming down this valley from the northwest, hits that stack horizontally, pushes the column of rising smoke back down into the channels. Smoke fills the cabin, you suffocate. Nora felt cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd worried about this, hadn't solved it. How do I fix it? Griggs thought, for a moment rubbing his jaw. Back in Illinois, we use metal caps. You don't have metal, but you could do it with stone. Build a square collar around the chimney top, open on all four sides, then cap it with a flat slab. One hits the collar instead of going straight down the pipe. Smoke exits through whichever opening faces away from the wind. They built it together over the next 2 days. Griggs directed. Nora did the lifting, the fitting, the mortaring. The wind cap added 30 inches to the chimney height and created a sheltered exit that would function regardless of wind direction. When they finished, Griggs stood back and studied the complete chimney system from base to cap. I've built a lot of things in my life, he said, This is the first time I helped build something I didn't design and came away impressed. 6 days later, the cap saved Nora's life. January 2nd, 1874. The blizzard came from the northwest exactly as Griggs had predicted, and it came with a violence that made the December snows feel like dress rehearsal. Wind hit the cabin walls with a sound like a locomotive. Snow piled 3 feet deep in 4 hours, then kept piling. The temperature dropped through 20 below, through 26 below, and settled at 31 below zero, where it stayed as if it intended to live there permanently. Nora had fired the chimney hard that morning, feeding it for 4 hours with the driest wood she had. She'd understood from the sky, from the way the clouds stacked against the mountains, from the way the animals had gone silent the day before, that something terrible was coming. When the wind hit, she was inside with the door opening, blocked by packed snow and enough wood for 2 weeks and enough food for maybe 5 days if she rationed hard. The chimney mass radiated. She could lean her back against the stones and feel warmth soaking into her spine, her shoulders, the backs of her arms. 42 degrees inside, 31 below outside, 73 degrees of separation maintained by nothing but stone holding the memory of fire. The blizzard held for 3 days. 3 days of wind that didn't pause, didn't relent, didn't allow a single moment of silence. Nora fired the chimney once every 20 hours, burning hard for 3 hours each time, and the cabin temperature swung between 38 and 52 degrees. She melted snow in a pot set against the warm stones for water. She ate sparingly. She listened to the wind try to tear her roof off and felt the earth walls hold firm, felt the mass of the hillside behind her like a hand pressed against her back, steady and enormous and patient. On the second night, she dreamed about her sisters. They were sitting in a warm room reading. She couldn't see the room's walls, only the warm light, and the two girls bent over a book, mouthing words. When she woke, the cabin was 40 degrees and the wind was still howling, and she pressed her face against the warm chimney stones and breathed. On the third day, the wind stopped. The silence was physical, a pressure change she felt in her ears. She dug out through the door opening, pushing snow with a flat board, working for an hour before she broke through into air so cold it seared her lungs and sunlight so bright she had to squint against the glare. The valley was unrecognizable. Drifts 10 feet high in places, the creek frozen into a white scar. Pine trees bent double under snow loads, some of them cracked and fallen. And her cabin set into the hillside, its roof level with the ground snow-covered and solid, had held against everything the mountains could throw. Aldrich arrived the next morning, found Nora outside splitting wood, her face chapped red, her movements efficient and sure. He sat on his mule for a moment and watched her work, and something in his weathered face shifted. "You made it," he said. Nora drove the axe into the splitting log and looked up. "Yes, sir." Aldrich didn't smile. "The Johnsons didn't. Found them yesterday, all 4 of them. Frozen. Wood ran out on day 2. Nora stopped. Set the axe down carefully. The name hit her like a stone. She hadn't known the Johnsons well, had seen them once on the trail, a young couple with 2 small children. The man had been building a cabin 5 miles south, conventional construction, conventional heating. "I'm sorry," she said. "They burned through 2 weeks of firewood in 3 days trying to keep warm," Aldrich said. "Your chimney used a quarter of that and held better temperatures." He looked at her cabin, at the stones, at the girl. "I'll be spreading word about this design. Folks need to know." That night, Nora didn't sleep. Not from cold. The cabin was warm. The stones radiated their patient heat. But she lay on her pine bough platform and thought about 4 people sitting around a fireplace that consumed their wood supply in 72 hours and then went cold. She thought about the children. She didn't ask Aldrich if there were children. She didn't want the answer she already knew. She thought about Ernst Kepler drawing in the dirt by firelight while men walked away laughing. Knowledge that could have saved the Johnsons, offered freely rejected because it came from the wrong person in the wrong accent at the wrong time. She thought about her own mother teaching her to read the snow, to see each thing instead of the overwhelming whole. Knowledge passed from a Shawnee woman to a girl who was now the only person in this valley who knew how to build something that kept people alive. For the first time, Nora thought about teaching. Not for money, not for recognition, because knowledge that stays in one person dies when that person does. January ground forward like a millstone. The deep cold moderated, slightly settling between 0 and 10 below most days, and Nora developed a routine that became the rhythm of her survival. Wake at dawn, fire the chimney, work outside while the mass absorbed heat gathering wood-checking snares, maintaining the drainage channel. Come inside when her fingers went white. Press her hands against the warm stones until feeling returned. Go back out. She set snares along the creek and caught 3 rabbits in 2 weeks. Not enough to stop the hunger, but enough to stop the worst of it. She was down to 1 meal a day, cornmeal mush made from Aldrich's gift, supplemented by whatever protein the snares provided. On January 18th, Marin Tully brought her son Isaac to see the cabin. The boy was 12, all sharp elbows and bright, curious eyes, and he asked questions the way water flows downhill naturally and without pause. But Nora didn't answer with words. She took Isaac's hand and placed it on the chimney the way she'd done with Marin. Let him feel the heat gradient himself from the scorching stones near the firebox to the barely warm stones near the exit. The boy's eyes widened. "Oh," he said, "it's like a river of heat running through the rock." Nora looked at him and saw Ernst Kepler's legacy extending one more generation. The old man in Milwaukee who heated his wife's house for 20 years had drawn in the dirt for a girl who was now teaching a boy by the feel of warm stone. Marin handed Nora a cloth sack. Inside 4 potatoes, a chunk of salt pork, half a loaf of bread. "Payment in advance," Marin said. "For spring, I want you to rebuild my cabin with this design." Nora's eyes went hot. Not because of the food, though the food meant survival. Because Marin Tully, a grown woman with her own land and her own grief and her own desperate fight to keep her children alive, was looking at Nora Whitfield and seeing not a discarded girl but a teacher, someone whose knowledge had value, someone worth investing in. "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. "I'll help anyone who wants to learn." Late January brought Silas Croy back. He rode up on a different horse thinner than the first, and Croy himself looked harder. The winter had stripped something from him. His bearskin coat was matted and stiff, his cheeks hollow above the beard, his eyes carrying the flat hunger of an animal that hadn't eaten well in weeks. He'd lost his swagger. What replaced it was worse. He didn't ask for half the cabin this time. He dismounted and walked toward the door without speaking, as if the conversation had already happened and the outcome was decided. Nora was inside. She heard the boots crunching snow and stepped into the door opening before he reached it. She had the axe in her right hand held low at her side. "Mr. Croy, I need this cabin," he said. No smile, no frontier law speech, just flat declaration. "It's warm, you built it, and I'm taking it. You can leave walking or you can leave carried." Nora looked at him. 2 months ago, she'd been a girl sitting in dust on the Bozeman Trail, too numb to cry. Now she stood in the doorway of a cabin she'd built from stone and timber and knowledge and will, and a man twice her size was telling her to abandon it. She didn't raise the axe, didn't need to. She held it the way you hold a tool you know how to use. "I built this cabin," she said. "Every stone, every joint, every foot of channel. And 3 people in this valley know I'm here, and every one of them will come looking if I stop being here. You want a warm cabin, Mr. Croy? I will teach you how to build one. But this one is mine." Croy looked at the axe, looked at her eyes, calculated. Whatever arithmetic ran behind those flat, hungry pupils came up with an answer he didn't like because he stepped back. "Spring," he said. "We'll talk again in spring." He rode north. Nora stood in the doorway until the sound of hoofbeats faded, and then she leaned against the stone wall and let her knees shake. She'd bluffed. If Croy had called it, if he'd stepped forward instead of back, she didn't know what she would have done. She was 16 and weighed 110 pounds soaking wet, and the axe in her hand was a tool, not a weapon, and she knew the difference even if Croy didn't. But he'd stepped back, and that meant something had changed, not in Croy, in her. Something in her face or her voice or her stance had communicated a truth that words alone couldn't. This girl would not move. February arrived like a closing door. A warm spell melted the surface snow. Then a cold snap froze everything into a solid sheet of ice. The world became glass. Game vanished. Snares sat empty. Foraging became impossible when every plant, every root, every berry was locked under a crystalline shell. Nora's food ran out entirely on February 12th. She boiled pine bark for something to fill her stomach, chewed leather scraps cut from her boot tops, felt her body begin to consume itself, burning muscle for fuel, drawing reserves from places that had no reserves left to give. On February 14th, she was too weak to walk to the woodpile. She lay on the sleeping platform and stared at the chimney mass and understood with the calm clarity of exhaustion that she was going to die, not dramatically, not fighting, just quietly in a cabin she'd built to survive winter because survival required calories and she had none. The irony was precise and cruel. She'd solved the cold, built something that held warmth through the worst blizzard in memory, and she would die anyway, not from the problems she'd conquered, but from the problem she couldn't build her way out of. She lay there for what might have been an hour, felt the familiar voices gather. Her father worthless. Hail, it'll collapse. Croy will see how long you hold it. And she listened to them, let them speak, because she was too tired to argue. Then underneath all of them, her mother's voice, quiet, practical, unimpressed by despair. Nora got angry, not the loud kind, the kind that starts in the stomach and spreads outward through the limbs like heat through stone. She rolled off the platform, crawled to the door, pulled herself upright against the frame, walked one step at a time to the woodpile that was 10 feet away and might as well have been 10 miles, dragged a log back inside, built a fire in the firebox with hands that shook so badly she dropped the kindling 3 times, lit it, watched the flames catch, lay down on the floor beside the firebox close enough to feel the heat on her face and slept. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats, lay still because standing required energy she wasn't sure she had. The door blanket shifted and cold air rushed in, and a shape filled the opening, blocking the light. Preston Hale stood in her doorway, holding a haunch of elk over one shoulder and a burlap sack in his other hand. He looked at her, at the gaunt face and the hollow cheeks and the eyes that were too large in their sockets. He didn't speak. He hung the elk haunch from the roof pole, set the sack of beans on the sleeping platform, looked at the chimney, at the warm stones, at the cabin that was holding 40 degrees, while the world outside was locked in ice. "You were right about the chimney," he said. "I'm adapting the design for my place. Consider this payment for the engineering lesson." He turned to leave. At the door he paused, his back to her, and his shoulders moved in a way that might have been a breath or might have been something he was pushing down. "My daughter's name was Catherine," he said. "She was 15. Then he walked out into the cold and was gone. Nora lay on the floor with tears running sideways across her temples and into her hair. She cried without sound because sound required energy. She cried for Catherine Hale, who died of camp fever at Chickamauga. She cried for the Johnson children frozen in their cabin. She cried for her sisters reading by candlelight in a wagon that got farther away every day. She cried for herself, for the girl on the Bozeman Trail, for the woman she was becoming through pain she never asked for. Then she stopped, wiped her face with the back of her hand, stood up, cut meat from the haunch with a sharp stone, cooked it slowly over the firebox coals, eating small pieces at intervals because her stomach had shrunk to the size of a fist, and too much too fast would make her sick. The protein entered her blood, and she felt strength returning to muscles that had gone thin and weak, felt her mind sharpen from the fog of starvation back to the clarity she needed. She built the fire up. The stones warmed. The cabin rose toward 50 degrees. Outside, the ice was beginning to crack. Somewhere upstream, water was moving beneath the frozen surface of the creek, finding its way downhill, the way water always does. The days were getting longer. The light lasted past 5 o'clock now, and the angle of the sun had shifted just enough that it reached the back wall of the cabin in the afternoon, warming the earth that held her shelter in its grip. On March 4th, the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in 3 months. Nora stood outside the cabin that morning and watched a droplet of water form on the edge of the roof, hang for a moment in the cold air and fall. One drop, then another, then a steady drip that left a dark spot in the snow below. She walked to the creek, knelt at the edge, and washed her face with snow melt water that was cold but didn't cut. She looked at her reflection in the surface and didn't recognize the person looking back. The face was narrower. The cheekbones stood out like ridges. The eyes were different. Not a girl's eyes, not a woman's eyes exactly. Something in between, something forged in a space where categories like girl and woman didn't apply because the only category that mattered was alive. She didn't know what she thought about the face in the water. She only knew she didn't want to go back to being the person she'd been before. That person didn't know how to build anything. The snares caught rabbits again as the animals emerged from winter burrows. Green shoots appeared in sheltered spots along the creek. The French drain she'd built along the back wall was channeling snowmelt exactly as planned, carrying water around the cabin in a steady trickle that deepened as the days warmed. Nora ate, rested, rebuilt strength that had been stripped to the bone. And she waited, because spring in this valley wouldn't just bring warmth and green things and the possibility of gardens. It would bring Silas Croy. He'd said spring. He'd meant it. And somewhere in the valley, Edith Pardo was still talking, still shaping opinion, still building walls that couldn't be torn down with an axe. The ice on the creek broke on March 15th with a sound like a gunshot, and the water ran free for the first time since December. Nora stood on the bank and watched it go fast and brown with sediment, carrying winter's debris downstream toward the Yellowstone and the Missouri and eventually the sea. And she thought about what she would carry forward from this winter. Not just the cabin, not just the chimney design, something harder to name. The knowledge that she could be broken to the edge of death and still find the anger to stand up. That she could be alone in the worst of it and still choose to keep going. That the voices telling her she was nothing had been wrong, and the proof was made of stone. The proof was warm to the touch. April came to the valley the way forgiveness comes to stubborn people. Slowly, reluctantly, and only after everything frozen had cracked open first. The snow retreated up the mountainsides in uneven patches, leaving behind a landscape of brown grass and black mud, and the skeletal remains of things that hadn't survived the winter. Fallen trees, a dead elk half buried that the ravens found before Nora did. The collapsed roof of a trapper's leaned to a mile downstream, its occupant long gone either to Bozeman or to the ground. Nora spent the first weeks of thaw doing work that wasn't dramatic but mattered more than anything she'd built in December. She reinforced the French drain, widening the channel where snowmelt pooled against the foundation. She replaced 3 firebox stones that had cracked through the winter, just as she'd predicted they would, prying out the fractured pieces and fitting new ones from the sandstone outcrop. She chinked the wall gaps with fresh clay mortar, where the old mix had shrunk and separated. The cabin was settling into itself the way all structures do after their first season, finding its weaknesses, revealing what needed attention. She was on her knees, patching a gap near the doorframe on the first Monday of April, when the sound of hooves reached her. Multiple hooves. She stood and turned, and her hand found the axe handle before her mind finished the thought. Silas Croy came through the trees on a bay mare, and this time he wasn't alone. A second man rode beside him, thick through the shoulders, with a flat nose that had been broken more than once, and hands the size of dinner plates resting on his saddle horn. Croy didn't introduce him, didn't need to. The man's function was his introduction. "Morning," Croy said. He sounded almost cheerful. "You recall me saying we'd talk in spring?" Nora stood in front of her cabin. She looked smaller than she had in January, still gaunt from the starvation weeks, her wrist showing bone where muscle used to be. But she held the axe the same way, low at her hip, balanced and steady. "I recall." Croy leaned forward in the saddle. "Here's how I see it. You built a good thing here. Better than good. Warmest spot in the valley, and I should know because I spent the winter in a dugout that nearly killed me twice. Now, I'm a reasonable man. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm offering a partnership. Me and my associate here set up our fur operation in your cabin. You do the cooking and the keeping, and everybody stays warm. Fair deal." "No." Croy's cheerfulness cooled. "You might want to think on that. I have thought on it every day since November. The answer hasn't changed." The second man shifted in his saddle, and the leather creaked, and Nora felt the sound in her stomach. 2 men, one of them twice her weight. The axe in her hands suddenly felt very light. Then from the north trail, the sound of a mule. Aldrich rode into the clearing at the pace of a man who had nowhere to be but intended to be here. He didn't look at Croy. He looked at Nora, and she gave him the smallest nod, and he understood everything, because they'd discussed this 2 weeks ago, sitting outside her cabin in the first warm afternoon of the year, drinking boiled pine needle tea and planning for exactly this moment. Aldrich stopped his mule beside Nora, said nothing, didn't need to. Then from the east, the sound of a horse at a trot. Barnett Griggs appeared through the cottonwoods, his surveyor's eye already taking measurements of the situation. He pulled up on Nora's other side and looked at Croy with the flat professional stare of a man who'd managed crews of 50 laborers and knew how to handle trouble. Then footsteps on the trail from the west, and Preston Hale walked into the clearing, carrying his rifle the way a man carries an umbrella casually, as if it were simply what one brought on a morning walk. He stopped behind Nora and to her left, completing a half circle that nobody had rehearsed but everybody understood. Croy looked from face to face. The old German farmer, the railroad man, the army engineer with the rifle he probably knew how to use blindfolded, and the girl in the middle holding an axe she'd used to build a cabin that all three men had reason to protect. Aldrich spoke first. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of 3 years of burying neighbors. Mr. Croy, this girl built this cabin with her own hands. Every stone, every beam. The whole valley knows it. The whole valley remembers. I'd find somewhere else, Griggs added. While the finding's good, Croy looked at his associate. The associate looked at the rifle. Some calculations don't take long. You people are making a mistake, Croy said, but he was already turning his horse. His associate followed. They rode south toward the pass, and they didn't look back. Nora had seen enough people ride away without looking back to recognize finality when she saw it. When the hoofbeats faded, Aldrich glanced at Nora. Next time you won't need to call us. He's done. Griggs mounted up and tipped his hat. Hale slung his rifle over his shoulder and nodded once the economy of gesture that said everything Nora needed to hear from a man who didn't trade in unnecessary words. They rode their separate directions, 3 men returning to 3 homesteads, leaving a girl standing in front of a cabin that was now undeniably and permanently hers. Nora watched them go. She thought about the November afternoon when she'd sat in the dust of the Bozeman Trail, numb and hollow with nothing in the world except a blanket and the knowledge in her head. 5 months. That was all the time that had passed between the girl on the trail and the woman in the doorway. 5 months in which she'd built a cabin, a chimney, a reputation, and something she was only now beginning to understand. Community. Not the kind you're born into, which can cast you out when it decides you don't belong. The kind you build stone by stone through competence and generosity and the slow accumulation of trust. Croy had seen one girl and thought he saw weakness. What he'd missed was the invisible architecture behind her, the structure of obligation and respect that connected her to people who understood that her survival and theirs were braided together. That was a different kind of masonry, and it held. 2 weeks after Croy's departure, Edith Pardo came back. Nora saw her riding up the creek trail and felt her shoulders tighten. The preacher's wife had spent the winter doing damage that Nora couldn't repair with clay mortar. 2 families that Aldrich said had been interested in learning the chimney design had stayed away after Edith made her opinions known at Sunday meeting. A young couple from the next valley over had ridden 4 hours to see the cabin, then turned around when they heard it belonged to that abandoned girl living alone like a heathen. But Edith looked different today. The iron was still in her spine, but something had bent behind it. Her face was drawn, and when she dismounted, her movements were careful in a way that suggested she was holding something together by force of will. She stood at the cabin door, didn't come in, didn't ask to. "My boy got sick in February," she said. Not to Nora exactly, to the door frame or the stones or the part of herself she was trying to talk past. "Pneumonia, 9 years old. Our cabin couldn't hold heat no matter how much we burned. I sat up with him for 6 nights listening to him wheeze and watching frost form on the inside of the walls, while the fireplace ate through our wood supply like it was paper." She stopped, swallowed. He lived, but just barely. And I sat there those 6 nights thinking about this cabin and the stones that keep warm all night, and I knew. Another pause. I need you to show me how to build it for my boy. Nora leaned against the doorframe. She looked at this woman who had called her prideful, who had compared her to her father's judgment, who had used her influence to keep people away from knowledge that could save their lives. She thought about saying no. She had the right. She thought about saying something, cutting something about pride and who really owned it. Instead, she thought about a 9-year-old boy wheezing in a cold cabin while frost climbed the walls. And she thought about her own sisters and about the Johnson children and about Catherine Hale, who never came home from Chickamauga. I'll help, Nora said. Not for you, Mrs. Pardo, for your boy. Edith nodded once, turned to leave. At the edge of the clearing, she stopped her back to Nora and said something so quietly the words almost didn't survive the distance. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Then she walked to her horse and rode away. It wasn't an apology. Edith Pardo didn't trade in apologies. But after that day, she stopped talking against Nora at Sunday meeting. And when people asked about the girl in the stone chimney, Edith said, she knows something we need to know. From Edith Pardo, that was practically a benediction. Spring became summer. Summer brought work. Barnett Griggs delivered the news on a warm afternoon in early April, sitting outside Nora's cabin on a stump with his hat pushed back and a look of satisfaction on his face. The railroad was pushing through by fall. They needed workers, and more importantly, they needed someone to feed them. 30 men, 3 meals a day, through the construction season. I told them about you, Griggs said. Told them you survived the winter alone in a cabin you built yourself. They figure anyone that tough can keep 30 men fed and working. Nora considered the offer. The money would buy real tools, seeds for a spring garden, maybe a milk cow. It would buy the future she'd been building toward since November. I'll do it, she said. Long as I keep my cabin, I'm not leaving here. Griggs grinned. Nobody's asking you to. This land is yours. You held it through winter. That makes it yours by any law that matters out here. The railroad crew arrived in September, and for 2 months, Nora cooked 3 meals a day for 30 men in a makeshift kitchen she built from salvaged lumber and determination. The work was exhausting in a different way than winter had been. Hot stoves instead of cold stone. The logistics of flour and beans and salt pork instead of the logistics of survival. She saved every dollar. In the evenings after the plates were cleaned and the men sat around fires smoking and talking about the homes they planned to build, Nora drew in the dirt with a stick. The way Ernst had drawn for her, she drew for them. One night, the crew foreman, a big man from Missouri named Hank, stayed behind after the others drifted to their bedrolls. He watched her sketch and asked questions, and Nora answered not with theory, but with results. 31 below for 3 days. Cabin held above freezing, on a fraction of the wood. Hank was quiet a long time, then, my wife and kids are in Missouri. I aim to bring them up here come spring. Show me how to build that thing, and I'll pay you whatever you ask. 2 more men from the crew built their own versions on their claims before the snow flew. That winter of 1874 into 1875, Nora helped Marin Tully rebuild her cabin. The work took 6 weeks starting in September, while the weather still allowed outdoor construction. Marin's original cabin was sound enough in its walls and roof, but the fireplace was the problem, an open hearth that consumed wood the way a river consumes snow endlessly and without return. They didn't tear it out. Nora designed around it, building the masonry heater against the north wall where it could absorb the cabin's coldest exposure and turn it into a strength. Isaac, now 13, worked alongside them every day. The boy who'd felt the heat gradient with his own hand a year ago had spent the intervening months thinking about what he'd felt, turning it over in his mind, the way he might turn a smooth stone in his pocket. He had an instinct for stonework that surprised even Nora, fitting joints by feel the way a musician plays by ear, sensing when a stone was seated right before the mortar confirmed it. He didn't ask for explanations. He watched, he touched, he tried. When he made a mistake, he studied it, pulled the stone, and tried again. Nora recognized the pattern because it was her own pattern learned from her mother, refined in the cut bank, in the alcove, and every frozen morning since. When they finished the chimney and fired it for the first time, the three of them stood in the cabin and watched the heat rise through the channels. Isaac pressed his palm against the masonry the way he'd done a year before in Nora's cabin. He looked at his mother, and Marin's eyes filled because her children would sleep warm this winter, without coats for the first time since their father died. Marin put her hand on the stone beside her son's and left it there, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers, and Nora stepped outside to give them the moment because it belonged to them. Aldrich went and added a smaller version to his existing cabin. He came to Nora's door on the first cold night in November and said 6 words, 3 years here. First time comfortable. Then he tipped his hat and rode home. One afternoon in the late autumn of 1875, after the last of the season's building was done and the first frost had turned the cottonwood leaves to copper, Aldrich rode down to Nora's cabin for no particular reason. She'd acquired coffee by then, real coffee bought with railroad wages, and she boiled a pot on the firebox, and they sat outside on stumps in the last warm light of the year. The valley spread below them, the creek winding silver through the brown grass smoke rising from half a dozen chimneys that hadn't existed a year ago. They didn't talk for a long time. Aldrich held his tin cup in both hands and looked at the smoke columns, and Nora let the silence sit because she learned that silence between people who trusted each other was a different substance than silence between strangers. It had warmth in it, weight. When I came here 3 years ago, Aldrich said finally, I figured this valley would kill everybody, and it would just be me and the mule. He sipped his coffee. Now there's 7 stoves burning. Nobody froze last winter. First time in 3 years nobody froze. He looked at his cup as if the coffee had said something interesting. I don't have as many ghosts anymore, girl. That's your doing. Nora didn't answer. There was nothing to say that the smoke columns rising into the copper sky weren't already saying. Sometimes you build a chimney and it heats one cabin. Sometimes if you teach what you know, it heats a valley. She finished her coffee and watched the old farmer ride north toward his homestead, and she understood that this quiet afternoon, 2 people sharing coffee on stumps, was the closest thing to a father-daughter moment she would ever have. It was enough. It was more than enough. By spring of 1875, 7 masonry heaters were operating in the valley, and people were riding from settlements a day's travel away to learn the design. Nora was 17 now, lean and weathered in a way that made her look both older and more certain than her years. She'd added 2 rooms to the original cabin, built a proper door with hand-forged hinges from the small forge she'd bought with railroad wages, and dug a root cellar that kept food through the summer months. She'd become something the valley hadn't had before, a resource. Not a commodity, not a laborer, not a wife or daughter defined by her relationship to a man. A resource. People came to her because she knew something they needed, and she taught them because she understood what Ernst Kepler had understood in Milwaukee. Knowledge shared multiplies. Knowledge hoarded dies with its keeper. But the teaching brought its own challenges. In the fall of 1875, a family named Ogden arrived from Wyoming Territory determined to build a masonry heater, but unwilling to follow Nora's specifications. The father, a stubborn man in his 40s who reminded Nora uncomfortably of Harlan, insisted on making the firebox twice the size she recommended. Bigger fire meant more heat, he reasoned. Simple arithmetic. Nora tried to explain through demonstration, building 2 small test fires of different sizes and letting him feel the difference in how the stones absorbed the heat. The smaller fire concentrated and hot warmed the stone efficiently. The larger fire wasted half its energy overheating the nearest stones while the far ones stayed cold. Ogden watched, felt the stones, argued for 2 more hours, then grudgingly built the firebox to Nora's dimensions. When it worked exactly as she had said it would, he never thanked her. But he told 3 other families about the design, and 2 of them rode to Nora's cabin to learn. That was how it went. Some people resisted the knowledge because of who carried it. Some accepted it grudgingly and passed it on without attribution. Some, like Marin and Isaac and the railroad men, received it openly and extended it further. Nora learned not to care about gratitude. She cared about results. Results were counted in warm cabins and living children. In the summer of 1876, a young surveyor named Thomas Renfield rode into the valley on a territorial government commission to document frontier architecture. He was perhaps 25, quiet in the way of men who spend most of their time measuring and recording rather than talking. He'd been cataloging what worked and what failed in Montana's climate, the construction choices that saved lives and the ones that ended them. He spent 3 days at Nora's cabin, measured the chimney dimensions with a steel tape, sketched the channel layout, calculated heat retention by recording interior and exterior temperatures at 2-hour intervals through the night. He filled an entire field notebook with observations, diagrams, and numbers. His report, which would eventually be preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives, documented what Nora had achieved: a chimney that retained 74% of its heat, compared to 18% in conventional designs, with total winter fuel consumption roughly 1/5 of the valley average, while maintaining superior interior temperatures. But it was what happened on the second evening that mattered more to Nora than any number in a notebook. They sat outside the cabin as the sun dropped behind the mountains, and Renfield asked the question nobody else had thought to ask. "Why didn't you go to Bozeman?" Nora looked at the valley, at the creek catching the last light, at the cabin that had been desperate shelter and was now home. "In Bozeman, I'd be the girl who cooks for wages. Here, I'm the person who teaches people how not to freeze to death. Those are different lives." Renfield nodded. He didn't say anything else. But he came back 3 more times that year, and each time he brought books: a volume on geology, a manual on structural engineering, a collection of essays on frontier agriculture. He didn't explain the books or present them as gifts. He simply left them on the stump outside her cabin, like a man leaving stones on a foundation one at a time, building something he wasn't ready to name. Nora understood. A girl who'd been thrown from a wagon for teaching her sisters to read was being courted by a man who brought her books. The rightness of it was almost too precise to be accidental. On his 4th visit, in the early spring of 1877, Renfield stayed 3 days instead of 1. He helped Nora replace the cracked firebox stones with granite she'd located in a new outcrop 2 miles upstream, harder stone that would withstand the thermal cycles without fracturing. They worked side by side for hours, and Nora noticed something about the way he handled stone. Not like a builder, like a man who understood that every material had a story written in its grain and density and color, and that reading those stories was a form of respect. On the second evening, sitting on the stumps with books between them, Renfield told her something he hadn't told anyone in the territory. He'd lost his father at 14 in a mill accident in Vermont. His mother had raised 5 children alone, taking in laundry and mending, and she'd insisted that every one of them learn to read and write and figure because she understood that knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you by accident or malice or bad luck. "That's why the books," he said simply. "Not because I think you need teaching, because my mother taught me that the best thing you can give someone is a tool they can use after you leave." Nora looked at him in the fading light and saw for the first time not a surveyor or a visitor or a potential husband, but a person whose deepest conviction matched her own. Knowledge matters. Sharing it matters more. They married in 1878, not in Edith Pardo's husband's church, but at Aldrich Went's homestead with Marin Tully and Barnett Griggs as witnesses. Preston Hale came wearing a clean shirt for what might have been the first time since the Army, and when Nora thanked him for coming, he said simply, "Catherine would have liked you." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her, and she understood the weight of it. The years after the wedding were the ones that proved what the winter of 1873 had started. Nora and Thomas raised 4 children in the earth-sheltered cabin, eventually expanding it to 6 rooms while keeping the original chimney at the heart of the heating system. Each expansion followed the same principles: mass insulation integration with the hillside. The cabin grew the way a living thing grows organically, each new section connected to what came before. By 1880-40, 3 families in the valley were using masonry heater designs based on Nora's original cabin. The winter death rate from coal-related causes had dropped from 12% to under 2% in 6 years. Ernst Kepler's knowledge, which had traveled from Germany to Milwaukee, to a dirt sketch by a campfire, to a 16-year-old girl's memory to a cabin built by bleeding hands, had changed the arithmetic of survival in Montana Territory. Aldrich Wennett died in the spring of 1882 peacefully in a warm cabin. Nora stood at his graveside and thought about the day he'd ridden 7 miles to give an axe head to a girl he didn't know. He'd said he had enough ghosts on the creek. In the end, he wasn't one of them. He died warm in a house that held heat through the night, and that was the kind of death that mattered out here, the kind where the cold didn't win. One afternoon in the summer of 1883, Nora sat on the stump outside her cabin, the same stump where Renfield had left his books, and watched Isaac Tully, now 22, ride off after spending a week helping a new family build their own masonry heater 12 miles up the valley. The boy who'd felt the heat gradient with his palm at 12 was now the valley's second expert teaching what Nora had taught him, extending the chain one more link. Marin Tully stood beside Nora watching her son ride away and said nothing for a long time. Then you know what you gave him, not the chimney design. The idea that a person's value comes from what they know and what they share. He never would have learned that from his father. Lord rest him, but he never would have. Nora didn't reply. Some truths are too large for acknowledgement. You just let them stand. The cabin endured through the blizzard of 1886 that killed cattle by the thousands across Montana, through the hard winter of 1893 when the temperature stayed below zero for 6 consecutive weeks, through the turn of the century when Bozeman grew from a frontier settlement into a proper town, and the railroad brought lumber and cast iron stoves and all the modern conveniences that were supposed to make the old ways obsolete. Preston Hale died in 1897 at 75 in the cabin he'd rebuilt, using the masonry heater principles he'd once told Nora would fail. The county obituary noted that he was a decorated Union Army veteran and skilled engineer. It didn't mention that the most important engineering lesson of his life had come from a 16-year-old girl he'd tried to talk out of building a chimney. Nora attended his funeral and stood at the back and thought about the haunch of elk he'd carried through the February ice and about a girl named Catherine who never came home from war. But the old ways worked. That was the thing people kept discovering. The masonry heater in Nora's cabin used a quarter of the fuel of any modern stove and held its warmth longer and more evenly. Visitors came to see it not as a relic, but as a solution. As energy costs rose and resources thinned, the design that a desperate girl had built from memory became more relevant, not less. In 1912, a professor from the Montana School of Mines visited the cabin and spent a week conducting measurements. He brought equipment Nora had never seen: thermocouples and pressure gauges and instruments for measuring airflow. When he finished, he sat in her kitchen, drinking coffee and shaking his head. "Mrs. Renfield," he said, "you built this when you were 16 with no tools and no training, and the efficiency numbers are better than most purpose-built heating systems I've measured in Butte. How?" Nora, 65 by then, with grandchildren playing in the next room, considered the question. "I didn't build it to be efficient," she said. "I built it to not die. Turns out those are the same thing if you pay close enough attention." In 1924, when Nora Whitfield Renfield was 67 years old, a reporter from the Billings Gazette wrote out to interview her about her early years. He found a woman with silver hair and calloused hands sitting outside a 6-room cabin built into a hillside drinking coffee in the October sunshine. He asked her how it felt to have survived what most people would consider impossible odds. Her answer was the same practical clarity she'd carried since the cut bank. "I didn't think about odds," she said. "I thought about problems and solutions. Needed shelter, found a hillside. Needed heat, remembered Ernst's stove. Needed to survive, so I did the work. The frontier didn't care about my feelings or my age or my sex. It just cared whether I could learn fast enough and work hard enough." She paused, looked at the valley, at the creek catching the afternoon light, at the mountains that had tried to kill her 63 years ago and failed. "Turns out I could." She lived until 1937, dying at 80 in the same valley where she'd nearly frozen at 16. Her children and grandchildren were around her. The community that existed partly because she'd taught them how to stay warm was still there, still building with stone, still heating with mass. Thomas Renfield had died 2 years before her in 1935, and the books he'd brought during their courtship still sat on a shelf he'd built into the cabin wall, their spines cracked from rereading their margins filled with Nora's penciled notes. She'd taught herself to read properly from those books. The girl who had been thrown from a wagon for daring to teach reading had spent 60 years reading everything she could find, geology and engineering and history and poetry, filling the hunger for knowledge that her father had tried to starve. On her last afternoon, according to Josephine, Nora asked to be carried outside. They set her in a chair facing the valley, and she sat in the October sunshine and looked at the creek and the mountains and the smoke rising from chimneys she couldn't see but knew were there. Dozens of them across the valley and beyond, burning the way she'd taught, heating the way Ernst had dreamed. She didn't speak. She just watched the smoke and the light and the valley that had been her home for 64 years, the place that had tried to kill her and had made her instead. She closed her eyes and the valley kept burning warm and steady, the way stone holds heat long after the fire is gone. The cabin stood until 1952, when Josephine Renfield Marek, Nora's eldest daughter, sold the property to the National Forest Service. They documented everything before dismantling the structure for safety reasons. The inspection team noted that the original masonry heater, 79 years old at that point, was still structurally sound and fully functional. The stones that Nora had fought with frozen, bleeding hands as a 16-year-old girl had held their integrity through 79 Montana winters. The clay mortar she'd mixed from creek bed deposits had calcified into something approaching concrete. The serpentine channels still drew clean. The lead inspector, a man named Colton who'd spent 30 years evaluating structures for the Forest Service, wrote in his report that in 3 decades of work, he had never encountered a vernacular structure with this level of engineering sophistication. He noted that the chimney's construction showed evidence of at least 2 phases of repair and improvement, always using the same techniques and materials, suggesting a builder who understood her own design well enough to maintain it across decades. He recommended preservation of key components for educational purposes. Several stones from the chimney were preserved and are now displayed at the Montana Historical Society Museum in Helena. The label reads, "Early example of Cochalufan-style masonry heater built 1873 by Nora Whitfield Renfield, age 16. Josephine Renfield Marek wrote in her 1943 memoir that she'd grown up believing all houses were built into hillsides with massive stone chimneys because that was all she'd ever known. It wasn't until she left Montana for college in 1910 that she realized her mother's childhood desperation had created something most trained architects never achieved: a truly passive heating system that worked with the landscape instead of against it. She wrote that the most remarkable thing about her mother was not the chimney or the cabin or the survival story. It was the fact that Nora never seemed to think any of it was remarkable. She'd needed to solve a problem. She'd solved it. The rest was just living. Modern masonry heater specialists who study her design note that she achieved a 4-to-1 fuel efficiency advantage using nothing but observation logic and stones from a creek bed. They estimate her cabin maintained comfortable temperatures in -20-degree weather on approximately 11 pounds of wood per day. A comparable modern cabin with conventional heating would require 45 to 60 pounds. But the numbers, impressive as they are, miss the point. The point is that a girl was thrown away by her father on a November afternoon. She was 16, alone, without tools or food or weapon, in a landscape that routinely killed people who had all 3. She survived because she'd paid attention when nobody thought she was worth teaching. She built something that lasted because she trusted the knowledge of a man everybody called crazy. She changed her community because she understood in a way that came from her mother and her own bone-deep stubbornness that knowledge shared is the only kind that matters. Ernst Kepler drew in the dirt for a girl nobody else would teach. Nora Whitfield built in the snow what nobody else would attempt. And 79 years later, the stone still held. That's not sentiment, that's engineering.